Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Just give it a moment while I see some folks are still joining. Okay. Uh, Welcome to Impact Financing, which is taking place during WLG at Large, our week-long members-only virtual conference. For those of you who don't know me, I am Hannah Shea with World Law Group, and we are hosting this session today that is sponsored by the ESG group and the banking and finance group. World Law Group has 15 practice and industry groups. Those are two of our groups. And we just went through a practice group refresh this year, sort of whittling down groups, merging some groups, renaming some groups, etc., to get us to 15 groups. So if you haven't taken a moment to update your profile in the last couple of months, I encourage you to log into our website and do so. Before we get started, everyone has been muted upon arrival, and I ask that you stay that way until we do Q&A at the end. We will do Q&A, and you can use either the raise hand feature or simply drop your questions into the chat, and we will moderate that. We will be renaming you to include your firm name if you haven't done so already. And one last thing, we are recording this session, just so that you know. And we will have this included in the recap for the whole at-large event and posted on the website. With that, I'm going to hand it over to one of the co-chairs of our ESG group, Bruno, with PLMJ in Portugal. Bruno.
Hi, thank you very much, Anna. It's a pleasure to be here. Good evening, morning, afternoon, however this applies to each one of the participants. I have the pleasure of hosting today's session on a very important topic. We'll be talking about impact financing and a lot of the aspects around the transactions that might be relevant for our practices these days. Before moving on to the subject that brings us here today, I'd like to do a brief presentation of our three panelists, not by a specific order. I'll start with Nandita Ganapati. Nandita has joined Kazan Invest in 2021 and currently leads the investor relations and finance team. She's 20 years of experience in financial services with global and Indian financial institutions. And she's also served on the board of Northern Arc Investments, which is a leading impact alternate investment fund that facilitates debt investments in the financial inclusion sector. We also have with us the pleasure of talking to Vanita Sinha. She's the Assistant General Counsel for Asia in the International Finance Corporation. So somebody spotlighted me and I lost my screen, sorry. So she's a lot of experience in the sector. She's been working at the IFC for 15 years, where she's also been principal legal counsel at the IFC, and also has an extensive legal career, both working on the private sector and also as an advocate. We also have with us today Hufriz Wadia. She has over 20 years. She's a partner at the World Law Group firm AZB Partners. She's over 20 years of experience, both in India and offshore, specializing in banking finance, and of course, these days, also doing a lot of work in the impact financing area, and also a big promoter and sponsor of today's event. And thank you for the three of you for joining us today. Just a brief couple of words on the topic itself. We won't be focusing on any of the specific areas. We'll be touching each one of them. We know that this, of course, regardless if the pendulum goes one way or the other, and nowadays, especially after the war in Ukraine and the sort of political backlash in some countries, we feel that this impact financing and overall ESG theme will continue being important for our legal practices in all of the countries. So this is something that both in the practices, if you already have experience in the area, or in the future will continue to be a part of our day-to-day lives. And so we felt this would be a very interesting topic for us to reflect on and to also share some practical experiences. We know that this is a very varied type of sector. You could either be talking about just producing corporate report and corporate disclosures touching on ESG matters. You could be focused on the impact financing or impact investment and focusing on additionality and materiality criteria. So there's a large field and a number of players in each one of the areas, both touching environmental matters, social matters, and governance matters. So there's and also one of the topics we'll be talking about is about standards and the difficulties that the continuing evolving regulation and standards also pose. Yeah, so this is just some initial thoughts to kind of structure what we'll be talking about. I'll start by asking Vanita on her opinion, what are the advantages that lenders can offer borrowers when choosing this type of impact financing, both in terms of cost and in other factors that might be relevant for borrowers when choosing this type of transaction.
So thank you, Bruno, and thank you for this invitation and this opportunity to speak to to your members. So let me start by talking about IFC. By the way, the views here are my personal. I don't represent the institution here, but I'm drawing on the experience that I've had working with an institution such as IFC. So IFC is a development financial institution. It is a member of the World Bank Group. It was established in 1956. And since then, we have been advising private sector and the government to really crowd in private financing for the purposes of development, resilient, and supporting green, climate, environment, and social standards. So what do we really mean by that? What it means is that we focus on impact as much as we focus on financing and the returns from financing. And we've been doing this since 1956. And when I say we're doing this, what we do is we really track the number of jobs that our financing results in, the carbon emissions, or how many small and medium enterprises that we support. So that's a little bit about what I have been doing. Now, to answer Bruno's question about, okay, what is it that why should a borrower borrow from an institution like ourselves and not others, and what are the advantages? I'd like to respond to this question in two parts. One is what are the incentives, and the other is what is it that we try and deal with, which is really about risk and identifying risk and finding ways to de-risking the projects, as we say. So when it comes to incentives, and I think the easiest one, or the much talked about ones, are really the sustainability linked bonds. And what do we really mean by those? Is that the financing terms of these bonds are linked to performance indicators of the issuer. So if there are, and the simplest example would be if the pricing it is at a certain level based on achievement of certain performance indicators, the pricing could go down, or vice versa, it could go up, which really then means that the issuer could get lower cost financing if it is able to achieve certain performance indicators which are impact related, be it ESG or any other governance or gender related performance indicators. Now, these are really these are linked. So the the sustainability linked bonds, in some ways, they are forward looking because they're looking at what the issuer is able to achieve over a period of time. But I'll take a minute to mention some of the other products that you see, which really are not incentives based on cost, but what attracts the borrower is to leverage on the assets that they already have, which could be green, and therefore be able to attract pricing, which may be relatively better than what they would get from a pure commercial finance. Now, the other part is, what do we really do? What makes, as you said, Bruno, impact financing attractive to the borrower would be when we are able to identify certain risks and find products or financing which is able to address those risks. And again, a good example of this is something called, we call it blended financing. There are again names in the financing world, but concessional financing, which comes in the form of where we identify a specific risk, and if just by pure commercial financing the project would not be viable, but we bring in this concessional financing. Again, these can be structured together with debt, equity, guarantee, other structured projects, can be linked to certain performance indicators, but is brought in order to de-risk certain specific issues that have been identified. And as an institution, and this is public, so I can speak to it, that we believe that where we are currently, in order to really use impact financing to get to the place where we want to be, particularly on climate and climate change, we definitely need to bring in a lot of blended finance, as we call it. What other incentives can we think of? There are a couple of interesting ones, and while it doesn't kind of lend to pure borrowing and more to Nandita's world, one of the things I have seen is, because IFC also provides equity financing and we are investors in funds, is kind of additional advantages that the borrower can have, and something on gender. So almost, I think, 69% of IFC's nominee directors are women. So when you bring in impact investors or impact lenders, you also have these additional benefits because they come with, or identified with issues that are broader than pure financial returns. And the last thing I'll touch upon is just standardization and certification. When we come in as impact lenders. So for example, when we do finance green building, there's something called EDGE certification, which is excellence in design. I have to look at my notes. Excellence in design and greater efficiencies. And that kind of a certification also helps borrower be able to have that stamp of approval, which then builds, if they're looking to get to a particular brand and establish themselves in the market, it really helps them get to that place, because this is the kind of certification that some of the development financial institutions can bring in.
Thank you very much, Vinita. That was quite a comprehensive view of the advantages that borrowers can look for. Moving on to Nandita, what would you feel that investors are looking for when they are looking at this type of financing and investment on their side?
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you to the WLG team for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be part of this gathering of lawyers from all over the world. Looking forward to hearing a lot of the views around the table. So I've actually had the benefit of wearing hats across being an investor in fixed income, credit, and now in private equity. And at Kaizenvest, we are an emerging markets focused impact investor, providing growth stage companies with equity capital, but working predominantly in the space of human capital development. So these could be sectors like education, companies that are working in the space of skilling, employability, companies that are really supporting the overall human capital ecosystem, lending to better equity, whether it's gender equity, digital equity, financial and inclusion, etc. So that's broadly the scope of what we do. And we work largely in emerging markets across Asia, which is Southeast Asia, and now Africa as well. So we've sort of had the benefit of looking at this, using this lens across different markets and across different kinds of companies. And the one thing that at this stage we really believe it's still at a very nascent position, right? In terms of what do companies understand about the impact that they're creating. So our first interactions with founders, with management teams, is to actually have to go with the whole idea of saying that every company generates impact, right? That's said. That doesn't require any sort of evidence. There is an impact that is being created. What we need to channelize this towards is to really understand what kind of impact, and of course positive impact, and eliminate the negative impact. So in that sense, companies are in very different stages of their journey in understanding what is impact and understanding how do you really improve the impact of their operations. So the first and the most important thing that we look for, therefore, especially given that we're dealing with companies which are more mid-sized, early growth, raising like a Series B or a Series C round, there are challenges, right? There are challenges around cash burn. So it's not necessary, they don't necessarily have a lot of cash set aside to invest in very sophisticated ESG systems. So what we look, therefore, at when we talk to these companies is, first of all, the intent. Is there an intent? Is there a willingness? Is there a commitment to work towards improving ESG sustainability impact standards? And that is, we get a sense of that through very many frameworks, right? For instance, simple aspects like saying that, is the promoter, as the management team, willing to invest in setting aside a team for ESG? It need not be a dedicated ESG officer, but somebody who can at least double hack, whether it's the operations, whether it's a senior person in the operations team or a senior person in the strategy team, somebody who's driving ESG across the organization as a stated mandate. So is there at least is there a willingness to create positions like that? So that's an indicator typically of where these companies are in their journey. The second is really about how much they're willing to work towards data collection, reporting, sit at the board and discuss some of these issues relating to ESG, sustainability, impact, etc. So I think those give us a very good sense of where companies are in this whole journey towards improving their own impact assessment, improving their own sustainability and ESG standards. So at least at this stage, and there are of course a lot of things that we look for, once we're in a company from a portfolio value creation standpoint. But I think where we are at this stage, the first thing that we want to do is really establish intent, establish commitment, and see where these founders and management teams are in their journey.
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic around intentionality, especially the difficulties that might arise to keep that intentionality and that mission across the whole investment time that you're there and when the companies are growing. So that's one of the very interesting points to see how that then enters the company's mission and how it continues to be present in the mission overall in the time that you're investing there. Hufries, now jumping to a more legal perspective, from a legal practitioner's perspective, we know that this ecosystem, it's more complicated, and there are a lot of advisors that advise on very technical aspects, focusing more on the E side of the ESG. There are a lot of the technical advisors. How do you feel that you deal with this on your practice in getting to know the more technical aspects that you have to deal with, for example, on impact and climate change? Do you feel that in your practice, what would be the advice that you have for people to get more information on that and work better with the technical advisors that usually assist on these types of projects?
Thank you, Bruno, for the question. And hi, everyone. I'm a partner at AZB, as Bruno said. Really, really happy to be a part of this program because impact financing is something that I hold dear to me. I do believe it matters in the long run. Though I am a pure structured financing lawyer and quite proud of it, but I'm glad that this adds a little bit of what I think of as the good side of the universe to my my otherwise pure commercial work in that sense. Okay. To your question, Bruno. I do think as lawyers, we don't have, at least in India, the documentation that I'm seeing in India. So we've done a few large green social sustainability loans, especially last year. We've seen, I think, about 8 really large deals happening. And of course, this is only in my team. India has a lot of this happening right now. IFC, ADB, all of these, the development finance companies are, and a lot of the private funds are focusing right now on India. And I mean, my forte is only India, so I can only speak for that. But what we do see is in a lot of the documentation, the loan documentation, we don't very often see the nitty-gritties of the details of what you have to comply with in terms of the technical details to conform to being green or to being social or meeting those parameters. What will very often be put into the loan documentation is the form of the certification by the independent valuer or by the independent authority who will then certify that the project, for example, suppose it's a green housing project, that the green housing project, for example, the EDGE certification that Vinita alluded to, that is being met. What we as lawyers will look at generally, as a very basic, of course, is that you must have in place your covenants, your representations, to ensure that not just at the beginning of the project, but on a continuous basis, you are conforming and complying with the requirements to enable the company to get that certification. But that's the basic, right? Now, if you want to, and as a lawyer, to be in all honesty, you can get by with that much. You do not need to necessarily know the details of the technical details of when say you're representing the borrower. You don't, as a lawyer, necessarily need to know what the technical details the company has to comply with to be green, for that project to be green, but it helps. And the reason it helps is the more you understand the project, the more you understand what the client needs to, what your lender wants, the better you are able to negotiate for your client when you're acting for the borrower, and certainly, definitely, when you're acting for the lender. It is only if you have an understanding of that environment or ecosystem can you genuinely lend value as a lawyer, because you're not there only to talk about the law that applies. So, for example, in India right now, we are lacking a definitive taxonomy on ESG. It's in the making, it's coming. But right now, we take a lot. So a lot of the documentation will, for example, rely on what IFC leads, in India, or we will look at the APLMA guidelines or what LSTA uses, depending on what form of documentation we want to use. But what generally in India does help is that the RBI has already established a green deposits framework. There they have already set out interim lists. So they talk about what would classify as green. So they talk about, of course, the renewable energy, the standards, the clean transportation. They are also bringing out they're also going into the more nuanced positions where they say not every green energy project qualifies for green. If, for example, the green energy project is generating energy from fossil fuels or from biomass using feedstock originating from protected areas, then or from nuclear generation plants, that does not qualify for the RBI's perspective as green. So it's interesting that the RBI is going that way. They are actually, clearly there is a group of people there that are putting their heads together, taking in input from across the world, and this is helping. What we do have just now is a complete reliance on the outside independent professionals who come in. So, for example, there are rating agencies, ESG rating agencies. To name a few, where we've seen Sustainalytics, Refinitiv, CRISIL, Deloitte, all of these. They very often are also guided by the Institute of Chartered Accountants. They have set out certain quality parameters for the rating agencies. SEBI also has certain quality parameters. So we have bits and pieces of law and guidance, nothing concrete yet. But as a lawyer, and across the world, I think if you don't understand where your client aims to get and where your lender aims to get, it becomes a little bit of only superficial assistance to your client. And I think it doesn't go too far. So yes, actually my answer was just yes, but I was a long answer. Sorry about that, Bruno.
No, it was
I'm done.
perfect because I think it gave us an idea on how you, of course, need to know the industry that your client is operating in, and also you have to be interested on the developments and how even if the regulation in your country isn't yet complete, you need to focus on the standards that are approved elsewhere and are used by multilaterals or by other type of development institutions. I think that's always a great advice and a great experience on your side. Thank you. Moving on to Nandita and moving from the E to the S of ESG, what would you say are the challenges that are facing currently the sector when we're talking about addressing social factors? And what could you give us as, for example, indicators that are being used and examples of certain projects that you've invested in that might be relevant for this S sector, which sometimes is a little bit forgotten when compared to the E part of ESG?
Yeah, sure. So you're absolutely right. The S in ESG gets challenging. I think primarily from the reason that a lot of the S indicators are qualitative. There are, of course, many quantitative, criteria and parameters that one can look at, but many of them are subjective, qualitative. But I think that's really the beauty of S, right? In terms of what it can really create if you're able to generate that positively. And unfortunately, today there aren't there are reporting standards and there are benchmarks that have been built across by institutions like the IFC. The GIN has its own impact assessment criteria. There is IRIS Plus. So there are a lot of frameworks today that are available, but it's sometimes tough to use it in a very standardized manner across sectors, across asset classes, and across geographies. So I think therein lies a big challenge around saying, how do you therefore benchmark company A in Latin America for which may be in a similar business, let's say lending to an SME segment, vis-a-vis a similar sized or a similar lender in Indonesia? Because the demographic is different, the target market is different, what they actually serve is different, and they could have very different sort of regulatory and other criteria that they function in. So I think that's a big challenge today that we are seeing in terms of being able to look at all of these companies with one single lens to say how are they performing on the S parameters vis-a-vis the other. And the one thing that we do, therefore, to sort of try and address this is to say that have performance indicators that are milestone linked, or that are just measuring companies' own performance versus where they were same time last year or 2 years ago. So Typically, of course, an equity transaction could be 7, 8 years, or at least 5 years. So over 5 years, there are at least 3 sets of, you have a baseline where the company is today. So for instance, so where it's indicators like, let's say, percentage of women customers, percentage of women borrowers, yes, it's much easier to assess. But when you want to assess things like how have your customers or beneficiaries of your product or service actually have had an improved livelihood because of availing that, right? It's difficult to establish exactly what their income levels have, how their income levels have changed, have they become, upwardly more mobile, etc., etc. So these are challenging, and therefore what we try and do is to say that, can company have its own benchmarks of saying where do they want to be in this journey 5 years down the line, right? You have a baseline right now. You have potentially a targeted end line in mind to say that this is where I would want to reach, and here is a path to do that. And that path could be broken down into various things. It could be specific actions that the company would like to take. It could be something as simple as, let's say, launching a new product or launching a new market that enables more inclusive, inclusive delivery of a particular service. It could be anything. So it could be better risk management systems to kind of cater to a particular segment. So where is the company today? Where is the company wanting to be 5 or 7 years down the line? And therefore building that path. So it's a very personalized, curated kind of an impact and criteria to say that, okay, this is what the company's journey is going to be, and this is how we'd like to support them. This is how we would want to support them through various incentives or otherwise. So that's at least on the equity front, we've seen that, because it's important. It's difficult to create things like covenants and interest ratchets, etc., in an equity product. Yes, that's very commonly done in a debt or in a loan program, but in an equity program, I think it becomes more about looking at each company with a different lens to say that, okay, where are they today and where would they like to get to, and what can we therefore do to support that transition from point A to point B. So I think that's been sort of one of the tools that we've used to at least measure the more social impact. And hopefully, I think over time, we will be able to really do this in a much more standardized and a manner across companies, at least operating in similar sectors.
And can you give us a couple of examples of projects where you feel that type of, not self-assessment, but self-proposal of KPIs that then you follow up and check if you see an evolution that you've been using that type of perspective?
So projects, I mean, in a typical equity transaction, yes, we've really seen how companies have evolved over time, in just kind of, by using some of these programs and pathways to say that this is where we would like to do. But having said that, we've had to provide a lot of external support to do that as well. So for instance, things like ESG trainings, things like, vision mission workshops. Really, is the company going down that same path of where they were 2 years ago? Are their actions aligned with what their vision was when we kind of entered, when we came in with an investment? So those are things that we've actually done over the years, and these have been very effective in just trying to understand whether the company has gone off track. And it could be well for good reasons they've gone off track, because yes, the market's changed. There's been something that's really happened that's been disruptive. So there's a new technology that they need to adopt to, which means that they deviate from their original plan. But it's a very good sense check of how the company has gone on its journey, and continuing to sort of make sure that they are on the path to get to where they want to be finally.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That type of training the companies you investing and accompanying them through their whole way that they do and they grow, and so that's a very interesting perspective also from on your side. Thank you.
And I think it's really the responsibility of shareholders that have an impact lens to do that. Today we have financial investors and we have impact investors. Unfortunately, not all investors are impact investors. We'd really like to see every investor being an impact investor. And we really believe that it is the responsibility of shareholders like ourselves who come in with that impact vision and with a stated objective of saying that we want to create social outcomes, even in addition to financial outcomes. We're not saying we're compromising financial returns. It is a private equity product. It is a private equity platform. So yes, there is an equity linked return, but there equally is a need to generate something over and above that.
Thank you. Vanita, on your side, given your experience, how do you feel this ecosystem has changed? And in the last 10 years, do you feel that the focus, so we've had the social development goals from 2016. Has this recent, I could say, recent focus changed anything on what was the traditional way that IFC operated, that of course has a long history on the development work? Do you feel that this has changed in the time that you've been working in the industry?
Thank you, Bruno. Since we are among lawyers, I was thinking when Nandita was talking about, when we do equity investments, exactly, there are no covenants, but when we have standards on the investee company, it's been a challenge to see when there is non-compliance, how do you really deal with it, right? So the equity world is difficult. And a quick comment on measurements, as Nandita was explaining, because that is so key to being able to deliver on this count, to be able to measure what are the expected impact outcomes and what the progress that it's made, and ultimately what the actual outcome is. There is a science. IFC has its internal measuring tools, but it is quite fascinating, because every time we do a financial credit assessment, we call it the anticipated impact measurement and monitoring. There's a complete mechanism, but it's quite fascinating. But absolutely with you, Nandita, that until we are able to standardize these things, the impact of measurement is also not there without the standardization. So to come back to what I've seen in the market, it's a positive development for sure. And I like the question also, Bruno, because a voluntary compliance by the private sector will not be enough for what the world or humanity is seeking to do, right? And therefore, we are at a time, and as we speak, most of us who are interested in this field are probably following COP28 and know what is happening there. So how have things changed? So if I look back at my own career in a development financial institution, um, there was a time when there were, few development financial institutions, the multilaterals who would speak about ESG, and there was emphasis on environment and social standards. But in the last, and coming back to the SDGs since 2016, and following which, I think what has been more impactful are the national standard, the NDCs that the governments have adopted. I think that has really made a change, because then the political regime in each of these countries know that yes, these are not hard coded and there are no contracts binding them, but most of these countries have gone ahead and made public statements that these are their NDCs, and they aim to achieve this by, say, 2025 or 2027. So that has been positive, and what it has done, it has definitely aligned the response of the countries that we work in towards this goal. Now, have we seen enough of that? Speaking of Asia in particular, I would say that the developed countries within Asia, so if I look at a Japan, say, I think Japan's been ahead, right? If you look at the way they're working towards transition financing, they've been very specific, kind of very focused on it, and they've managed to do a much better job than some of the other countries. If I look at other Singapore has done very well, right? They've got, the green, they came up with the Green Finance Action Plan. Um, and they are incentivizing companies that, when you look at innovation in the financial sectors, a lot of that comes out from Singapore. And to your point, of Freeze, about the Reserve Bank of India, which is a central bank in India, taking a lead on it, I think that's really the way to go. If you look at Singapore, it's really MAS that's taking the lead, right? Similarly, if you look at Hong Kong, it's the Hong Kong Monetary Authority that's taking a lead. I know that they've even they are part of a platform that IFC's put together to mobilize financing towards climate projects, and HKMA has put in a large sum of money in that platform. So um, I would say that the response has been different, because if I look at some of the other countries in the region, where at least on the issue of environment and climate, the need is far more, because we are either, whether it's coal or whether it's plastic pollution, polluting the sea, we are, kind of, we have an issue in the region. The action is not enough, particularly because the task is so big. Uh, but that said, I'm still positive, because if we look at what we as lenders or IFC has been able to do, um, uh, in the last 1 year itself, there's been a blue bond in Mongolia. There's been blue bond in Thailand, and these are, and there's a social bond in Philippines in the health sector. So yes, it's a long way to go, but I think we're on the right track. And even countries, the smaller countries and countries which have real issues in terms of um, basic needs to look after their citizens, are still appreciating the fact that we need to go this way, because this is the way. Sustainable development is the way to go. So remain positive, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, I think that's the big debate. I think all of us here are optimists in that front. I think then at the end of the day, it's going to be how you can balance the financial side of the investments with the other goals. And I don't know if we're doing enough with the urgency of the situation that we have, that are focusing as much or a little bit more on the other criteria than on the financial return. I don't know. Probably in some years, because of the urgency, the relationship between the both will have to somehow be adjusted. Before we move on to the Q&A, I had one last question for you, Friz. So we've been, which is important because both Nandita and Vanita have talked about a certain lack, the difficulty around metrics and a certain lack of standards. Do you feel that this situation and situations like greenwashing, what type of legal risks do they tend to create for investors in this space, and other type of problems that this then creates for the whole industry and the type of work that you do?
Right. I think that's something that really does need to be dealt with and in fact, very often we will, if we go in early on a transaction, we will very often talk to our clients, whether lender side or borrower side, about this issue. And we sometimes highlight to them a few examples of what's happened in India. And of course, people know the whole, I don't want to take names of the larger retail, or I mean larger fashion groups that have gotten in trouble because of the greenwashing. But in India, for example, SEBI has, as late as, of course, only in February 23, this year, when they issued their green debt security principles, what they did is they brought out very clearly that you are not allowed to cherry pick and highlight only green. When you're highlighting your green practices, you are not allowed to cherry pick and obscure practices that are unfavorable to the construct of whether you're green or not. So essentially, SEBI as a regulator, SEBI is a securities regulator, RBI is a finance central bank, right? So SEBI very clearly came out with this concept of greenwashing in the regulation itself. They also put in provisions that allow for, so by regulation now, if you do not, if you have, named your debt security as green debt security, and then it turns out that you're not actually green, you have a statutory or a regulatory right as a debenture holder to require early redemption of the debentures, of the bonds. Companies, some large companies, so this is in the public domain, so I can name a few. So like Hindustan Unilever, which is otherwise a massive group in India, they were, hauled up by the Central Pollution Control Board, because they made certain claims that some of their products, for example, were 100% natural or environment friendly. It turned out that they were using a lot of synthetic ingredients. Godrej soaps had the same thing, where they said they were using biodegradable that their soap was biodegradable, all the packaging was biodegradable, all of that. They were hauled up by the regulator for advertising, ASCI, because it was found that this wasn't actually the case. Air conditioning, in the air conditioning industry, where you say eco-friendly or 5-star rating, this has been found to be incorrect, and this was part of the data group. They were fined by the advertising agency as well, or regulator as well. The India now has the National Green Tribunal to look at regulation, the environmental regulations. They have been fining some really large companies for damage that has been caused to the environment and public health, especially around the power plants and ports. And then things like claims for Ayurvedic or natural or herbal products, where it has been found so often, especially in some of the larger ones, to be for those food products to actually be unfit for human consumption. So all these, interestingly, it's not one consolidated authority in India, but it's several authorities and several courts, several tribunals that have some kind of oversight. And the way I look at it is, while India could get better, we at least have sufficient measures in place and sufficient grievance redressal mechanisms. So there's in advertising, in the securities world, so the securities regulator, the finance regulator, and the Green Tribunal, all of these really come together to help put some kind of curbs on companies that may even think about going the wrong way. I think from the perspective of greenwashing, it's only that as long as you have these provisions in your documentation, that from a financing perspective, that you can force redemption, early redemption, that would discourage greenwashing. You will. I mean, very often we'll look at the ratchets, then the margin ratchets. But greenwashing should really just be a complete event of default, one that cannot be cured, because it points to unfair practices, which perhaps a lender and an investor may not want to encourage. So as a lawyer for the lender or the investor, I would rather strongly say that there should be strong curbs against greenwashing and strong penalties for greenwashing in your documentation. I think India at least has some decent regulatory curbs, but more needs to be done for sure. But
Yeah, I think it's a start that will help the industry, of course. And now we have 10 minutes for the Q&A part.
So I can just say that you don't have to scroll back through the messages. Bruno, no worries. I wrote them down. So this is a question for Vanita. And the question is, how long does it typically take to negotiate a sustainability linked bond from start to finish?
I would, and then the related question on equity finance and how long does that take? But I don't have there isn't number, and it's difficult for any lender to give a specific number because it would depend on diligence on the company. If it's a public issuance, then it's all market driven, right? Then IFC is probably just an anchor investor. We do become anchor investors. So the timelines are not driven by IFC. And if it is a private issuance, then we've done deals in 2 months. We've done, deals that has taken years together. So it really depends. It's a facts and circumstances question. If there's a specific deal or something that you have in mind, I'm happy to connect you to the investment teams who really are, leading transactions for IFC. So sorry, I don't have a specific number, but I hope the response is helpful.
Thanks, Vinita. And anyone else, if you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat, or you can use the raise hand feature. Another question, Bruno. Do you feel the level of knowledge in the overall market has improved? Is the ecosystem more complete nowadays in terms of advisors? So that's something. Go ahead.
No, yeah, I think Vanita touched on that a little bit with the difference between what happened since 2016 and the involvement that each country is having in terms of their national objectives. And Lufries also mentioned that, of course, you have to deal with a lot of technical advisors, but you have to know on the industry side what is important. So I think that more on that is probably also a question related to the number of projects that I'm sure that Nandita, of course, that's part of her industry in terms of having to look at I don't know how many projects and only choosing 5 or 6. Have things changed recently, Nandita, in terms of the volume of potential investees that you're looking at compared to a couple of years ago, or is it still within the same level of companies that are trying to get invested and get investment from you?
So is the question in reference to specifically impact criteria in general, the number of companies that are looking to hit the
in
market?
general, the number of companies that, for example, when you're considering investing in doing impact investment, have the type of targets, the number of targets remain the same? Are you seeing more companies, more funders looking at that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, certainly we're seeing a lot more companies, just the way the whole startup ecosystem, particularly in emerging markets, have kind of transformed over the years, whether it's technology, whether it's innovation-led led businesses. We've seen a lot of companies enter this space, and because we look at education, EdTech has been a very, very big theme. It's now Gen AI. Seen a lot of companies that are trying to kind of incorporate AI into their business models, particularly in pedagogy delivery. So yes, we've absolutely seen the number of companies go up quite substantially in some of these spaces, but a lot of them are still very, very early stage. They don't really fit within our investment criteria because we look at slightly later stage companies. And the other side, of course, as we all know, markets have been really tough from a liquidity standpoint. Given where global macros are, given the whole liquidity sort of scenario, the war, etc. So yeah, that's kind of led definitely to a significant demand supply gap, which is hopefully going to turn a little for the better next year when we start seeing some liquidity easing out. But I would say in the last 2 years, it's been pretty challenging in terms of finding the right quality deals because many of them are very early stage. not really proven models, not really established really the product fit in the market that they want to be in. But it's always heartening to see where, that there is still continues to be a very healthy startup ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think that's also some of the information we're seeing in a lot of the countries where you have that information, is that 2023 is a difficult vintage for VCs, but that things might be getting better hopefully next year. I think one last question just to wrap up. Now from the lawyers, Vinita and Hufries, what would be your advice for lawyers looking at this space? Of course, the experience is the mother of everything, right? And so having done some transactions always puts you in a better position. But what do you feel people should be looking at, and like strategies to keep informed on everything and trying to learn more about this space?
Okay, I can. So I'll answer it in two parts. One is, if from a more intellectual perspective, given the mission, and I would want to put it as a big picture, as lawyers, we have to be innovative. I just feel that the plain vanilla financing is not going to get us the billions of dollars that we need in this space. And therefore, I've seen, business people, investors come out and say, we want to do this. How can you help us get this product? So that being innovative, thinking of structuring, Hufries, you spoke of being a structured finance lawyer. That's constant. That is what we need to do. So that's at an intellectual level, innovation and coming up with, continuing to find ways to bring in more financing, attract more financing, different kinds of capital to impact financing, be it pension, be it insurance, be it, philanthropists. And there's a lot of conversation around it. So that is key from an intellectual perspective. But from more specific, getting into the weeds now, I would say, and again, Hufries, you touched on it, know the documents, particularly in the lending scene or even in the equity scene. At the end of it, we have to be able to enforce the rights, right? And you may not know, you may not have read that Annex EBC, but the ENS law, the experts, they are not lawyers. So to be able to translate the technical requirements into enforceable obligations or enforceable rights is really key. Because yes, like I said, it all has to be voluntary and wish we were there, but we are still in a place where we want to bring in incentives. We want to bring in certain structures where we are able to get our stakeholders or our investing companies and borrowers to that ultimate place. And in order to do that, as lawyers, we want to make sure that our contracts have rights that can be enforced. And sometimes that gets missed because we think, oh, this is not my bother, the specialist can look at it. But the courts, it's the legal eye. So that's my tip on a very on documents.
And I mean, I'm completely with you, Vanita. You really touched on some sensitive points for a lot of lawyers. But yes, but in addition to what Vanita is saying, what I do think is as lawyers, as transaction lawyers, we have to remember whether we're acting for the lender or the borrower, or sometimes transaction lawyers, we must you have to have buy-in to the project, to the transaction you're assisting. And therefore, you must also, in addition to being a lawyer, be a facilitator. Sometimes that means you go out of your box of what your scope is. Understand the project, the document, understand the where each party wants to get in the ultimate end game. And sometimes it will require, at least in the more developing countries, and I think definitely in India, very often we need to sit the business teams down and guide them through what the document means, and especially the ESG impact focused provisions, because it scares first timers, even companies that have done this 3 or 4 times, it does scare them. It very often you have a mindset, where you're thinking yet another 5 pages of compliance, and I've got to make sure that independent valuer or independent expert comes in and gives me a certification that I've ticked every box. But so you need to sometimes dirty your hands. Sorry to say that, but I mean, you need to sometimes get into that, understand it, so that you can guide your client, and so that you can help the transaction through. Because these kind of transactions are better than other regular structured financing transactions. I do believe that. That's all from me, Bruno.
Great, thank you. I think we'll wrap up today. Thank you very much for the 3 panelists and for the eloquent and very interesting contributions. And I'll pass on to Anna. I don't know if you need to have some closing messages on your side.
Great. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you for moderating. And thank you, Nandita, Vanita, and Hufreeze for joining this panel. It was very interesting. And we will have the recording up on the website, as I mentioned, if this is something that you want to share for colleagues, for members only, of course, behind the login. Today wraps up WLG at large, the week-long members-only conference that I mentioned this was part of at the beginning. We have a speed networking session at 12 p.m. Eastern, and that will be the final session of at large. So we hope to see some of you there. And with that, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you online soon.